Next is our administrative agenda. I'm sorry. It's late already. Presentation of the feasibility study. Just a note, PTA Council would normally provide their, have their appointment with the board. The PTA Council President, Ms. Delmont Small, had a family emergency and is not able to join us this evening. Good evening, Mr. Galliu.
Good evening.
Seems like it was just last year this time we were doing this.
Yes.
You look very refreshed.
I am feeling refreshed. Yes. If we're efficient with our time, I can talk a teeny bit about that at the end. But it's nice to be back. The feasibility study is a document where we review our long-term plans. The objective is to make our plans plain for all to see on an annual basis. A couple of important things that we're studying in the feasibility study are the CIP options, redistricting plans, and considering a strategy for the 2014 through 2024 period, the long-term planning period. We use this as an opportunity to highlight these options and look ahead to future redistricting plans in previous feasibility studies. Staff is recommending the appointment of an attendance area committee and the initiation of the middle school redistricting process for 2014. This graphic here has been used for many years, but it's designed to show the relation of the feasibility study to the capital budget. As the capital budget process continues every year, redistricting is not every year. You might hear that, and I don't blame people for feeling that way because we're just coming to the end of a 3-year cycle of redistricting. But that cycle was based on the fact that we were preparing to open 2 important new facilities, the Duckett's Lane Elementary and then Middle School 20. So these this year we're begin with the redistricting goals, the attendance area review, going through the Board of Education review in the fall with a decision in November. And depending on what redistricting decision is made, it may affect our capital planning and feeds back into our long-term capital plan. Advertise for volunteers and hope to be ready to go forward with the attendance area committee shortly. Some of the goals that we wanted to talk about this evening, these are goals that form the core of our current thinking as we near the end of this challenging 3-year cycle of redistricting. The first is to open middle school number 20 in August of 14, and this school is for relief of the middle schools in the along northeast quarter along Route 1. And another part of this goal is we want to limit the amount of student movement to what is necessary. So really, as we complete this, this will culminate with the opening of middle school 20 in August of 2014. In this process, we've heard some new ideas, and we intend to listen for more. We've tried some new ways to receive public input this year, and we were very pleased with the experience. So we intend, as another goal, to incorporate feedback from the public input sessions that we held and possibly use that format. And the format happened to use a neutral facilitator, and allowed, what I was very impressed with is it allowed for a large group of people to generate input very quickly, which, as you know from observing the committee meetings that we currently hold, while it's good to train a group of people to test scenarios, there's another group of people watching those meetings that doesn't have an opportunity to provide any input. So it might be interesting to see how we can use that format to enhance our participation and feedback that we're receiving. And most importantly, I talk about this as a 3-year cycle. We intend for this to end and for a pause where we can take some time off from redistricting and reflect and adjust how we do redistricting, look at our procedures, look at even our policies, collect other input from outside or from consultants. And, you know, we had the opportunity to do this before this recent cycle. It's probably hard to remember. And some of the changes that may have been identified in recent years as our process being more transparent was a part of that, having the time to make some changes in a year where we weren't doing redistricting. So we are looking forward to being able to take advantage of that time to bring a better process to the community as a whole. The notable changes underway. The Gilbert architecture company that we worked with in the past for the middle schools, it was in 2009, did a capacity evaluation, and we're presenting those changes as a part of this plan. This is the beginning of the process, you know, so we'll probably have some more discussion on that. We have a educational planning company that serves as planner of record for many different school systems across the country, doing an evaluation of our enrollment projection method and the what-if scenario generator that we use when we evaluate redistricting plans. And put something else important out there, this plan is recommending the closure of West Friendship Elementary School. We don't, we've talked about this in the past. There's been chronic underutilization of capacity at that school. And we've talked about, you know, making better use of Western capacity. We've talked about what's coming in terms of Turf Valley. And it's our considered recommendation at this time that the process for closing this school needs to begin. It's a process that won't be easy, but there's a policy for it. It takes time. We have things that we need to do in advance of redistricting. So I think that what we're doing here with this document is beginning that process, and look forward to getting further input on it. The Gilbert capacity changes are presented in an addendum report, but I felt this slide brought some of the most important aspects of the changes to your attention. What we have here is the most important schools that are associated with the redistricting are along the Route 1 corridor or fairly closely associated to the Route 1 corridor. So Elkridge Landing Middle School and Mayfield Woods Middle School up in the northern part of the corridor. And then in the southern part of the corridor, it's Patuxent Valley Middle School, which is really adjacent to Murray Hill and Hammond. So those ones are highlighted as the ones where we're looking at changes to capacity. And what Gilbert did was they built upon the analysis that they did in 2009. So those reports have been available to people over the years, and we have surveyed these principals and looked at the current utilization of the buildings and how the program is functioning, and come up with this recommendation so that we can be more closely in tune with our current educational specifications and our current renovation specification for what is a classroom, and more fairly present, more equitably present our redistricting plans. Coming back to the public input process, like I said, we asked open questions in these meetings. This was a little bit of a new experience for me, so I just wanted to thank some of the other people that have helped to put this kind of thing together. But these open questions, what I've learned is you actually get very full answers from them. And the neutral facilitator is a very important part of the process because you know, I may get high marks from some people, but there are certainly people that become frustrated and they need to hear from someone else, or they need to be able to speak what their truth is to someone that they feel they can trust. So I think that it's really important to look at some of the most important comments that have risen to the top out of this process. What do they value about the redistricting process, the current process that we're using? They valued the ability of parents to share their input and have it considered by the board. They valued the transparency and availability and accessibility of information. And they valued redistricting less frequently with less impact on students' families, and neighborhoods. That might have been more of a comment of what they thought should happen, given that we have just done 3 years or 2 years and beginning a third. But I think that we need to celebrate the fact that we're getting some good marks for transparency with this process. Yes, ma'am. Karen? Wait to the end? Okay. All right. One of the other questions that we asked was, what goals should guide the Board of Education in redistricting? So the guidance that they were seeking to give was long-term changes, redistricting less frequently, and considering alternatives to redistricting, working towards pure feeds in excess of 15%, preferably 20% feed from middle to high school, and move the fewest students to maintain equity of programs. And I'm certainly not surprised to see feeds near the top of that list. And I certainly think that the meeting was for listening, so we have to take a look at these comments, and we have brought some of them to bear in our current redistricting plan. And what factors would you like to see the system consider as it begins redistricting? Considering neighborhoods and community impact versus the polygons. Try more long-term alternatives to maintain community stability and lessen the impact. The distance between homes and schools was also an important factor, and equity of programs at sending and receiving schools. So when you listen, you can begin to think differently. And here's some of the things that we're thinking differently in this current plan that we've proposed to you. Longer-term redistricting planning. Take a pause from this recent cycle. Incorporate the feedback in our procedures and our policy. Continue with capacity evaluation. We need to take a look at the elementary school level and get through that, so that we can be sure when we look at future plans, we are comfortable with the numbers that we're using for capacity. Update our methodology for enrollment projection process. Replace the existing database tools with more spatially enabled methods that draw on our GIS expertise. So, the before and the after, the no action plan for redistricting. What we have here is what would we be looking at in 2014 with middle school utilization if we took no action. So of those first schools that I mentioned, let's start with Elkridge Landing. We'd be at 120% utilization, and Mayfield Woods 112. Patuxent Valley is not a school that would be overcrowded, but it is an area where there's coming growth, and it's adjacent to Murray Hill, which would need redistricting, which would be at 131% utilization. And then Hammond is not overcrowded, but you'll remember when we did the first year of elementary redistricting, we redistricted out to Fulton. So there's some companion redistricting that needs to be done if we want to honor the feed goals. So now let's take a look at what we had in the feasibility study last year versus what's in the feasibility study this year. Because one of the big discussion points that we've tried very hard to respond to in this plan is making a more disruptive, less disruptive plan that is more focused on the goal of opening middle school 20. So there was middle school redistricting proposed in these blue areas shown on this map that's not in this year's plan. And it'll take some people time to absorb that information. You may hear from citizens that are looking at the old feasibility study. We're going to make sure that the connections are there on the website so they can get to it and see it. But there's what we are looking at now in these charcoal lines is a much more precise redistricting plan that keeps us within the ballpark on how much we intended to do and how much disruption is necessary in order to open a new 662-seat facility. So to get down to the specifics, we have redistricting in this plan from Bonnie Branch Middle School to Elkridge Landing Middle School. We have a small amount of redistricting from Ellicott Mills Middle School to Bonnie Branch. We've heard about those types of changes before. We did our best to keep it as minimal in this plan as possible. Much of the planning is just simply redistricting into a school. So there isn't that domino effect, which brings more neighborhoods to the table with their additional issues. So you see Elkridge Landing to the new middle school in the vicinity of Oxford Square and Duckett's Lane. You see from Mayfield Woods to the middle school in the areas that would correspond to the movement that was made from mostly from Bellows Spring to Duckett's Lane Elementary. We also have movement from Patuxent Valley into New Middle School 2. These are some of the areas that we're moving. We moved from Deep Run to Rockburn as a part of our plan, and some of the other areas that currently go to Deep Run. And from Patuxent Valley Middle School to Hammond, this is getting over into the Guilford Road area. These are some of the changes that line up with that elementary redistricting 2 years ago. And this next slide brings us down further south. Like I said, we are making changes from Patuxent Valley to New Middle School number 20. From Murray Hill into Patuxent Valley, you remember how Murray Hill would have been at 130% utilization. These changes are obviously very important to addressing that. And then from Hammond out to Limekiln, these are the changes that follow the Hammond to Fulton movement from 2 years ago. And then we have movement from Murray Hill to Hammond. So as you can see, it's much more compact as far as the plan. Keeps us much closer to what we had set out to do in terms of opening a new facility. So the post measures for this plan highlight a couple of important issues. You'll see that we're leaving capacity in Middle School 20 for future growth, which we know is coming. We have not addressed Ellicott Mills Middle School. This is probably best identified as a weakness of the plan. However, if you were to honestly look at how much relief Ellicott Mills could receive from middle school number 20, you can't say that this is the additional redistricting up into Ellicott City is anything more than using existing capacity. It becomes the domino that had brought so much attention. So we think that at the outset, we're currently using temporary capacity at Ellicott Mills. We have an opportunity for further study with what we want to do about Ellicott Mills, but we know that Middle School 20 cannot relieve Ellicott Mills. And so having a principle at the beginning of a process of being as least disruptive as possible and being focused on the opening of the new school, those principles make it hard for us to recommend additional redistricting with Ellicott Mills. There is Wild Lake obviously will be over the target utilization, but we have a capital facility plan for Wild Lake. And Limekiln, as you can see, is just slightly outside of the target range. It does not dramatically increase. It stays right in that range. And if we wanted to look at that further with the committee, we have opportunities, as you can see, with adjacent capacity, which would not be inconsistent with the movement that was made at the elementary level. But in terms of our priority goals of staging ourselves for the areas where the strongest growth are, this plan is very successful in addressing those concerns. Another area, let's come back to the feed question. This plan has some very important middle school feeds that are going to be improved. What these lines are showing you here is the Elkridge Landing attending area in charcoal with its feeding elementary schools. Elkridge, and Rockburn. So you can see that where there had been in both of these, as we get to Patuxent Valley, where you're dealing with situations where you had 5, 6 feeds, you're improving it to just 2 feeds. And no plan is perfect. And you're going to find situations where we have lingering small feeds and some created small feeds as part of this. But this is our attempt to show you that we are trying very hard to get towards this concern that has been raised by the community and still open a new facility. So instead of in the past where we were in a rush, we were opening facilities every year, and we ended up creating maps that had slivers of elementary neighborhoods feeding into middle schools. We're trying here to at least start off on the right foot with feeds. So this plan minimizes the number of students moved. It's 50% less than last year's plan. Like I said, it creates, with that previous slide, creates strong feeds. 4 of the schools that are very important to this plan: Elkridge Landing, Murray Hill, Hammond, and Patuxent Valley. And elementary feeders are reduced from 16 to 8. And it does not address the Ellicott Mills overcrowding because Middle School 20 can't address the overcrowding of Ellicott Mills. So the timeline, through June and August, we'll have the attendance area committee review plans. Again, these meetings will be open to the public, and the schedule will be posted on our website. September 10th and 11th, these will be the meetings where the draft redistricting plans will be presented. We're taking a look at the format of that meeting. We'll see what we end up doing. Maybe we can try some of our new ideas there. October 24th, the final staff plan is presented to the Board of Ed at 7:30 p.m. And then November 5th through 19th, we'll be getting to know each other very well, and the board meetings regarding redistricting, with November 21st being the meeting where the vote is scheduled. So at this time, myself and Ken Roy and any other senior staff will be happy to answer any of your questions.
Mr. Lacey?
I'll just go one at a time. How you doing, John?
I'm well, thanks.
How's your trip?
Well, like I said, I'll save the treat for the end.
Did you just get back?
2:30 this morning.
Oh, wow. I was, how can I just start? I do not see in the supplemental report or anyplace else the 11 criteria for the redistricting. What page is that on? I have the copy from last year, but I don't have the supplemental report. And the supplemental report last year had the 11 criteria used for redistricting, and I can't find it in any of the things that you had that you posted.
Did you get this?
Yes, I did. What page is it on?
I just assumed.
It's not in there. I looked at it.
It's in the policy.
It is, Mr. Lacey, it is in the policy. If you can't find it, it is in the policy.
Okay.
Pages 3 and 4? Is that what you mean?
There are.
She's looking for the
I'm looking-
factors.
And if you want transparency, with all due respect, then post them in there so that people
On
don't.
page 2.
Page 2. Thank you. Where? Of what?
Redistricting is considered, it's on the feasibility study, page 2. Yep, the one you just
And it's all-
held up.
the one you just held up, but the current year. Page 2. Says when redistricting is considered, policy 6010 school attendance areas identifies 11 factors to be considered in the
Yes.
development
Are they listed?
and all 11 are listed. Yeah,
Where?
page 2
Of a feasibility study.
of the feasibility study.
Thanks for all the help.
Oh, thank you,
Hopefully-
thank you. So,
Report.
okay. Apologize. Please forgive me. Then I can go and answer one of my other questions. Who's going to be determining who's on the redistricting committee?
Well, again, we would be following the policy.
Okay.
So that actually has.
Would be you?
I am not alone in doing that. So it's a superintendent's. The committee is advisory to the superintendent. So we will be putting together a committee using other staff to select the membership.
Dr. Fuss, I want to know who is going to be making that decision, because before, there's only been one person.
Well, certainly it will be, Joe will be part of the vetting process, but then it'll come to executive team, and we'll make that collaboratively as senior staff.
Okay, and number 2?
Can I just step in there?
Go ahead,
I don't,
yes.
and this is not intended in any way to be argumentative, so please take it that way. It never was just my decision. It's always been in collaboration with my supervisor and with the superintendent at the time.
Joel, I've asked you that on a number of occasions, and you've told me it was you. In fact, I was at the board of the PTAC, and I asked you in a room full of people, and you told me it was you.
Well, you asked who interviews the people, and it is me that has interviewed them in the past.
Okay, I think
I
that-
think that the improvement that you've asked for is to perhaps bring someone else into that interview room, and I accept that as an improvement to the process.
Okay, I just want to go on record as saying that I don't think this is a fair process. I never have. Number 2, I'm looking at Guilford and some of the other schools before who lost the entire PTAs as a result of redistricting, and is farms going to be considered in any way?
Certainly, in this report, we are providing an analysis of the farm changes with this particular plan. Any other plan that is analyzed throughout this year, we will also have a report that includes the changes to the farm, so that among other considerations can come into play when people decide what they think is the better plan.
I just am not happy. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Lacy. Mr. Meshkin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gallahue. And I'm sorry that you had to come here and make this presentation after just arriving at 2:30 in the morning. I feel your pain. I've done that before.
Yeah.
A few different things just to clarify. So with regards to the presentation, you talked about the Gilbert study. So we've done the Gilbert for middle schools, and by virtue of that, the chart that we have, it's on, gosh, I can't remember what slide it is, but the one that's entitled Gilbert Changes.
Okay, I'll go back to that slide for
Copy
you.
right under your laptop.
Perfect. So for that chart for what we are looking at now, capacity in this feasibility study has been adjusted.
Yeah, for the purposes of this report, we made the changes.
Okay.
It's obviously a continued discussion.
Were those changes made for the Apfo chart that we did a couple weeks ago?
No, they were not.
Okay. So I'm glad to see that we've actually done a calculation to kind of recalibrate some of those school capacity things. I think that's important. You mentioned in some of the feedback we heard from the public, looking at ways that we can refine our polygon calculations and getting a better understanding of that. Is there anything that's going to be done as part of the attendance area adjustment committee to look at that? You mentioned it was a suggestion. Is there going to be anything that's going to be done with regards to recalibrating or more specifying the polygon counts?
Well, the retooling takes a certain level of effort, so the consultant that we've been working with has been giving us some guidance on how it's being done in other places. And I'm not going to, this isn't meant to somehow trumpet ourselves, but they are actually pretty impressed with some of the things that we currently are doing. But they do recognize the sensitivity of the concern that you have illustrated in the past, where we have a model for testing redistricting impact, and the model uses a projection that is based upon the school's numbers boiled down to the polygon level, and a couple of citizens that happen to live in that polygon will take a look around their neighborhood and do a little census and say, wait a minute, that's not the exact number. Now, you and I have done this for a while, the rest of the board. We all know that this is a model. This is for us to study potential changes, and it all works out overall. So they're looking carefully at what other types of options and techniques are being used. One of them uses a raster-based technology to try to get the same idea, but instead of at the polygon level, get all the way down to essentially a pixel and multiply your pupil generation rates at that level. And that might even free us, so to speak, from using the polygons and modeling. And you could just move lines and come up with a new calculation. All of that kind of work will take some time to retool, and it's not out-of-the-box technology. There are companies that sell some rudimentary school planning software. It looks very nice, but it actually happens, a lot of it, including our consultants, tends to work with it in a more simple way. And there's a certain level of expectation of expertise in the community, so we want to make sure we match what we've been delivering with the improvements that any consultant might bring to the table, and leverage both our internal expertise with their external expertise. So that long, tedious answer is to say that I will still be using the WIFR with committees this year, and it's the best recommendation that I can make. It will make it too confusing. So it'll be my job to help everyone to understand the complexity of why a model doesn't give the exact same number of students that they know are in their neighborhood, and why that's okay. And so I'll work very hard to use my listening skills and then come back with a nice response that helps people to get to recognize that when you're modeling, you sometimes need to make assumptions and test them. And so that's one last piece I just want to mention. That part of what DeYoung Richter's looking at is how can we more helpfully express the accuracy of our current tools and make that available to people. I know that people come into this process and it's overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there. So what can we do to change our reports to make them more accessible? Having all the information there, but having it be very hard to read isn't necessarily transparency. And so we're hoping that they can give us some improvement recommendations.
No, I appreciate that. And I always, having gone to public meetings where you speak, and I think you're one of the nicest guys to speak with people in the school system, one of the nicest guys, I think, caught up in one of the most broken processes that we have.
agree.
But you talked about transparency there before I get to my next question. Arlington, Virginia has a do-it-yourself tool. I don't know if you've seen it, they've used for boundary lines.
Yeah, I had talked to them about that. That's the kind of thing that if we retooled, we might be able to. I guess at this point I'll just say I like that kind of thinking, and that's we need to make something that's robust enough to operate on the web.
Right, and that's what Arlington has. So it's something to think about. My next concern deals with the inconsistencies between the chart with regards to capacity in the feasibility study versus the Apfo chart. I'll email you the list of them, but it basically affects Walled Lake Middle School, Burley Manor, Hammond, Patuxent Valley, and Mount View, where you have the exact same time periods, and the numbers are completely different between what's over capacity and what's under capacity. And I don't understand, because every time I bring this objection up, for some reason it falls on deaf ears. And then sometimes it's said, well, you're just looking at different times, and I'm not. I did graduate from the Howard County Public School System. I'm a smart guy. And the numbers aren't the same. And so I think that's important when we're talking about, for example, like in your little graphic, you talked about the capacity at Patuxent Valley Middle School being affected. And there's a difference there. At Walled Lake Middle School between 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, they're completely different between the charts. At Burley Manor Middle School, they're completely different between 2016 and 2021. And so that's important because that's a fundamental assumption.
So are you talking about capacity or projected enrollment?
I'm talking about whether it's what the overcapacity is and what the undercapacity is. So, for example, like Burley Manor's overcapacity in this chart, 2016 through 2021, but not in the Apfo chart. And at Walled Lake Middle School, we're overcapacity 2022 to 2025, but not in the Apfo chart. There's this, and it's the same years, same school years.
But it's
numbers
not
are
the
different.
same projection.
That's my point. It's not the same projection.
And that's been Mr. Gallagher's point every time we go down this road.
Right. And so what So you're saying that we should adjust our projection methodology so that we are producing the same
I'm saying that
kind of
whatever
numbers
we're
every year?
projecting to use to redistrict schools and build new schools is the same projections that we should be using to determine the housing code that puts students in the houses to determine what the capacity of
Oh,
the school
it's the
is.
same methodology. It's just 2 different years of data. So what that data is telling us is a different result for, say, that 2021 number.
Correct. And so the one that we used a month ago was a year older than the data we're getting now.
Okay?
I understand the process. I'm not stupid. And so I don't understand.
Please, I'm not saying anything like that.
Oh,
But what I wanted to
I understand,
understand
but
is, are you trying to say,
The assumption was we keep saying the same thing and the same answer, but the answer still doesn't make sense.
well, what are you trying to say, that the projection that goes into the Apfo chart should be updated to the new projection?
Absolutely. I'm saying
Okay.
we should be giving them the
Now I
most accurate
understand
data because they're next month going to be voting on a housing chart using data that we know is 1 year old, and at the exact concurrent same time, we're looking at a feasibility study that has more updated, more accurate information. I think we do a disservice to the county. But I'll keep saying that over and over again, and hopefully it'll resonate at some point in time. With regards to the overall plan that you proposed, I like the fact that it limits change. I think that's wonderful. I give all the credit to Dr. Foose on that because she has pushed that, and I'm grateful for that. I hope that we'll look at, and I appreciate the fact that you've done some public meetings so far, and you're really good in front of the public. I've seen you there. I hope that as we look at some of those meetings that I think you had from November 9th through 13th, or so, I can't remember what the dates were in the plan, where we're going to be going through and have public hearings at some point in time there. I hope we'll look at making a public hearing more accessible for people. I had proposed during the budget process maybe having one at Howard High School and doing a remote meeting or that type of thing. I think that may be helpful for people as well. You know, we talk about transparency, we can use technology, but we can also move our meetings there and do that. So it's something maybe the committee can take a look at. And that's all I have, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Meshkin. Mrs. French?
When did the Gilbert report come, and when is the board going to get the full Gilbert report?
The Gilbert report is being released with this document. It is online.
And is this the full Gilbert report?
For this particular round of analysis, yes. There's a whole basis of the analysis that, for the middle school level, occurred in 2009 that also goes along with it. You remember those big binders?
Yes, I have that. When the capacity for high schools was being recommended to be changed, the board received those recommendations in public, the board deliberated, and the board voted and determined. But this process occurred without, and it was put in a new document, the feasibility study, without the board even knowing about it. So I really have concerns about suddenly switching based upon the Gilbert report that we haven't even seen until now. And I requested, thanks for making the big copy so I could read it, but when it says number of teaching stations, you don't have how many teaching stations the schools had in 2012 and 2013. These are, from what I understand, what Gilbert thinks should be assigned to each middle school.
Yeah, in that chart, that is correct.
So
What we have is the current capacity as a seat count, 662, where in that case that would be 34 based upon the formula. So we haven't, in that chart it didn't happen to include that. I can pass something out with that.
I have
or
deep
whatever.
concerns about the same capacity of 662, but having a delta of 8 or 11 classrooms between schools. When we approved the plans, the blueprints for these schools, each one was brought by staff, recommended by a superintendent and an architect, that the school would be built with enough teaching stations to accommodate the enrollment of 662. And so now, suddenly, this is by some other, the Gilbert study, they're saying, well, no, this one can have 40 teaching stations, not 34. And I feel like I want to walk through that building, and I want them to show me and to count for me where these teaching stations are, because I've been in a number of schools that don't even have enough storage space. You see paper photocopy paper in boxes in hallways. So I just wonder if the principal is, obviously the principal's been using that space. How will they, if suddenly we say, okay, now that space is going to be a real classroom, what is the principal going to be losing the ability, the flexibility to use that classroom for? And how are they going to make up for it? See, I think there's more to this than just numbers. It's human usage of a building. And I've got to say that Mount View was the ideal. That was what the board approved in the ed specs as being the absolute ideal middle school. And then with the downturn of the recession, we had to reduce the building by order of the county executive at that time, to reduce the middle school by at least 25% in space and with the same capacity. So I just find it strange that schools that are newer than Mount View are considered to be deficient in net square footage. I mean, I'm really having problems with this whole chart.
We certainly bring forward concurrently, with the process and more in-depth discussion on what Gilbert found. If you go to the floor plans that are in the report, they went classroom by classroom and identified whether they were sufficient size to host a classroom per our specs.
To the current specs.
Not to the renovation specs.
Right, to the renovation specs, which is not what they were 15 years ago.
So there's absolutely some schools that just have more classrooms than others. And the other piece of it that Gilbert tried to consider was looking at the net square footage of those schools. If there was, in the case of Wild Lake, where you had, I believe, almost 15,000 net square feet difference
Right.
from the prototype, we didn't feel it was fair just to count the teaching stations. Thought it was appropriate that we actually take away some classrooms in recognition of the lack of support.
Well, that's what I expected to happen for the older buildings. I'm having a problem with the newer buildings. And so when you're going to add 8 teaching stations to Burley Manor, which is an older school, I just really don't, I don't see the logic. Mayfield Woods is, these all were pretty much the same prototype. And yet they are so discrepant in teaching stations that I just don't understand it.
Yeah, we can bring forward, concurrent with the process, a more in-depth discussion, but those schools are in fact bigger in terms of net square footage than our prototype.
Mr. Lacy?
Yes, I just looking at page 5 of 26, the executive summary. It talks about there appears to be an inconsistency from 2007-2008 original education specification analysis of Patapsco and Wild Lake Middle Schools. That's the one that really piqued my interest. The building designs are based on the same educational program and the same footprint, with the exception of 9 classrooms added to Patapsco Middle School. And it talks about the differences between, at that time, 2 schools, same time,
renovation,
Sister schools.
sister schools renovated, but then it says they identified Broad Lake Middle, what is it, for +9 for fewer classrooms, and Patapsco for 33. I just don't understand. What led to that?
We built an addition.
The addition.
The addition went
The
to
addition.
Patapsco.
Yes, but didn't you also renovated Wild Lake at the same time, right?
But we
No.
did not build an addition.
The
at
footprint
Wildwood.
of the building remained the same.
Okay, so, and just correct me, of course, because this is my first time on here, although I did see the same confusion and the same questions and the same problems with the WIFR and the polygons and the same talk last year when I sat in each and every one of the meetings. And I was looked at as if I was, had two heads. But can you explain to me why now we have problems with Wild Lake being on overcapacity and problems with Patapsco? Why were not both schools given, since they have the same footprint? They started were they both overcapacity when you renovated?
I can't speak to that. I'd have to
This is
come back.
2007, 2008. Was anybody here then?
We were here then.
No. The addition was done prior to that. I'd have to come back with some details. I don't know that right now.
You mean in comparison to Patapsco when they did renovate it and
Yeah.
add the space?
Yeah, just explain that to me.
To take a look at the old enrollment numbers at that time.
Dr. Stiggy?
Thank you, Mr. Gallahue, for your report, and Dr. Foos, too, because I really appreciate that you took the time to really sit down and get the community input on this in terms of the goals and what they wanted to see differently through the process and with the board. One thing that struck me of interest was when they said that to share input and have it considered by the board through the process. And one of my frustrations last year was the number of emails that we received and, responding or keeping track. I know you all did a great job, and they would be forwarded to staff to try and sort of consolidate particular areas or particular suggestions. But I wondered if you had any thoughts at this time in terms of going through this in the fall, in terms of how we can better streamline, concerns, questions, suggestions, that are coming into the board. I mean, we have some, technology ideas coming up. You talked a little bit about changing the methodology, but just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, we also tried something with these meetings that I'd like to expand upon. And it uses technology, but it also recognizes that you need to give people a couple of general questions to try to bring them to some kind of point. Because, I want to be sensitive to everybody's concerns, but, I paid two people to read these emails and summarize them, and sometimes these comments, these long comments about someone's personal experience, makes it hard to distill down, like, what is it about, version G of the plan that you have a concern with, and so, some people could say it's not, that it's important to hear the human side of it, but it's such a difficult process to gather all the information. So what we found worked well is we used the web form technique that was used with the safety committee and with the safety meetings that we held, and with these two pre-redistricting forums. And it had the questions in them, and we were able to get the input already formatted into an Excel spreadsheet, so you could put together some quick overview metrics without distilling the people's comments down to a point where if a board member wanted to still go through one by one and read what they said, we still have the table with their input and they can see it. So we'd like to try that. I don't think it's possible at this time to say that replaces email. If someone wants to send the board an email, I don't think we can stop them. But what I'd like the people to feel is that this web form will be a place where they can register their feelings about whatever current generation of a plan we're working on, and then we can report back quickly because it's in an Excel format. You could say, it looks like, half the people we're hearing from this week are in favor of Plan G or whatever. It's a starting point for a discussion. So I hope that people won't feel we're trying to minimize their input, but it's just a matter of trying to get people to come to a point so that we can understand that feedback. There's other techniques out there, for gathering people's input, but this one happens to line up with software that we currently have licensed and some internal expertise in running it. So we'll call it a pilot and see how it goes, and then when we go back to the years where we'll take some time off from redistricting, we'll take a look at, compared to the year before, how did the experience go with receiving the input? And then, of course, in the meantime, the public relations is taking a look at citizen feedback tools, other software, whatever we might get into. So perhaps we'll merge on that later on and use some new technique for collecting input. So a web form with a couple of good questions, kind of like the ones you saw in this presentation, and a place to say which plan they're reacting to, and a way to let us know who they are so we can get back to them with follow-up questions if need be, I think we'll be more successful. One other thing, real quickly, I had a person last year who was very upset because their email address ended up in South Asia somewhere, and somebody called them to market some kind of business to them. And so what happened was we were getting these emails, like, it was, akin to drinking from a fire hose, reading all these emails. So they were coming in, and so I was having the staff block out any identifying information as it came in, and they missed it. They missed this one person's email. And so I had a long conversation and learned about this person's frustration, and I thought, well, we need another way to get the identifying information, because we'd like to know, who are we hearing from? Are we mostly hearing from people outside of the areas that are going to be affected by the redistricting? Are we mostly hearing from people that are in the Murray Hill attending area, whatever it might be? We'd like to have that information, but we don't need to share the specifics online. And this technique allows us to separate that information so that it doesn't have to go up online or in any meeting that we might have. So we're hoping that will help us. We'll learn more.
Thank you. Just a couple other questions, and I mean, it'll come up future in discussion, but just, and we talked a little bit about this at the county council meeting, but like lime kiln, the ones that are going to be near overcapacity, out, like lime kiln, but it looks like lime kiln will be pretty steady, but have you factored in the Maple Lawn, continued development of the Maple Lawn community in those projections?
We actually, it depends on what you're talking about. If it's the continued build out of the approved Maple Lawn development, yes, that's factored in. If you're talking about the comprehensive rezoning that's going on, this discussion, no. That has to come into the next projection. So we can't guess what zonings will be approved by the county council acting in their role as the zoning board. We have to stick with what's already currently approved for zoning, and that's what the Department of Planning and Zoning gives us in their housing projection. It's based upon currently approved zoning.
And then, was it Ellicott Mills?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts, plans on how to handle that in the future, or another middle school?
The first point I would look at is whether using single relocatable classrooms versus a modular unit is a way to help us to deal with that site in the near term. The numbers won't look any better in our reports because we don't count the relocatable capacity, but we will know the quality of the facilities that are installed there, and we can all talk openly about that. Then the next step would be to look again in a future redistricting discussion as to what we could do with existing capacity. That's as much as people dislike us looking at moving through their neighborhood to the next neighborhood, that's an important part of our ability to show that we're good stewards of the public resources that we have. It's just going to be this delicate balance and looking at a redistricting plan and how disruptive it might be. And if we can't address it, perhaps capacity is the final way to address it. The problem I see, first of all, is that we're at our current ed spec in terms of the capacity of that school. So I don't think we're going to be able to recommend an addition, but we're not necessarily at a point where we have a need that brings us to the level of a whole new school. So,
Well, I think the comment at the end in terms of after this middle school redistricting that we're going to take a breath and look at the whole process and look at, the whole planning and things like that. I think that's a good suggestion for the.
and in the interim, I think improving the current, what we have temporarily on the site might give us time.
Just a second, I'm going to have to excuse myself. I'm going to turn things over to Mr. Mishkin. I'm in the midst of a migraine issue here, so I'm not going to be much good. I'm going to go in the back for a little while, and Brian will take care of things.
All right, did you have a list as to who was next after Ms.
Actually,
French, right?
Mrs. French.
All right, Mrs. French.
I did have some other questions. Could you please send us the number of current teaching stations per middle school, very similar to what is in the third column for Dunlogan Middle School? If there's no change, if it's 34-34, what is the current teaching station? What is the change, plus or minus? You did that very well for a few of the schools, but not for all of them. The other thing I want to know is, were the principals involved in any of this discussion or of any of this data before you put it in the feasibility study?
The answer to your first question is yes. I will provide that information to you.
Thank you.
I'll follow the format for communicating to the board, but I'll certainly get that out to you. And the answer to your second question is also yes, they were included. It was kind of exciting. I should have probably trumpeted a little bit more. We used GoToMeeting. We hosted these meetings with each principal, and GoToMeeting is a technology where you can talk on the phone and have a internet view of the leader of the meeting's computer and what's on the screen of the person. And they can actually share that with a particular person who's in the meeting that has something they want to say. So the architect and a staff member were on the phone with the principal. Most of the time, sometimes I had to get off the line and do some other things, but the architect and the principal, certainly all floor plans were reviewed by room through this technique. And what it allowed us to have is a real good one-on-one where they could, who knows the floor plan better than the principal themselves of the school, and talk it through with the architect, who might be taking a little bit more of a global view. And there was back and forth. There were questions asked. The feedback I received from all of the principals was that they really appreciated the opportunity to have such a direct connection with the architect. And maybe it doesn't replace that site visit that you imagine might happen, but what it did was it allowed us to have a lower cost consulting situation that was still very much valued by the participants. And since there had been site visits in the original 2009 analysis, where they went around with the measuring wheel and went through the whole floor plan, we felt that it was be wise to try to leverage that analysis before we went out and did it again, if possible. So this presented us with a great opportunity, and I know there's other products. I don't mean to sell one particular one. It just happened to be what this consultant has a license for, and I thought it worked very well. And so we definitely, each principal had 1 full hour in a meeting with the architect, and most of them had a few follow-up emails and phone calls to get everything straightened out before the report was pulled together into a draft.
Thank you for involving the principals. As I said, my concern is that the board has not approved this change of capacity or a change of teaching stations, and so I have a concern with it being incorporated into a document already. But the one thing I am concerned about is, I know it's good to say we're only going to concentrate on redistricting for this area, but in this last round of redistricting, parents were worried that they would lose the appropriate feed, most particularly those from St. John's Lane who were being sent to Waverly. They said, then correct our feed. And I had almost assumed that we would be doing that in this round. So what you're saying is that we're not going to make those corrections.
Well, I'm saying that the current staff recommendation at the beginning of the process is to focus on the opening of the school. But it's a process with many voices, including your own right now, as you're saying this particular point that you're making, and that could possibly result in a difference in the ultimate plan that's adopted.
Well, then use this document here to sell me. If you have new data on Mount View Middle School and you've increased the teaching stations, I'm assuming from 34 to 41. This means that the building is no longer over capacity?
Let's take a look at the,
90%.
That what this does, in effect, is says
Correct.
that this is not a crowded middle school. More students can be accommodated with ease and with appropriate instruction in that building.
so I'm turning to page 38 and looking at the the western region with Mount View at the bottom of that list. So it has the capacity, I'm sorry, that's the pre-measures. I need to turn to the post-measures report, which is Fund 41. So on 41, you see Mount View has 798 as the capacity utilization, and you can see the capacity, or as the the capacity of the school, and you can see that the capacity utilization is anticipated to be 91.1% utilization, ranging pretty close to that in the next few years. So that's an effect of this report, this Gilbert report. It's not, if you go back to the pre-measures and you look at where Mount View was at 109.8, 103.8, you know, those higher and higher numbers in earlier projections, it's not that we did any redistricting in this plan, it's that we have the Gilbert report in the post-measures. So that hopefully
Right.
is a way to lay bare the effects of these plans, at least in terms of the capacity.
So if there were interest, those students who are now incorrectly, the parents believe that they were in an inconsistent feed by going to Patapsco, and should be at Mount View now if they're going to Waverly. Otherwise, they would be a very tiny number leaving Waverly and going to Patapsco, and they wanted them to stay with the full new cohort at Waverly to go to Mount View, that there is room for them.
I think, you know, that the purpose of having a committee and having this, all these citizen input opportunities is so that it isn't just the staff report coming back to you in October, that we've heard other input. So we'll be listening in the process for what other types of, not necessarily just that in particular, other input that we might receive.
Thank you, Joel.
Is that it, Mrs. French?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Alrighty, Ms. Valancourt.
I have a question just on the Gilbert, because I think this is great that we had the middle schools looked at. But can you explain what the significance is of the state-rated capacity versus what we are now currently going, saying that our actual capacity is. It looks to me like there's about 1,200 student difference. The state-rated capacity is what they use to determine whether they're going to help us pay for a new school, correct? How do we get them to accept our actual numbers? We can't?
No.
But the actual number is the actual number. Is there something that can be, they just use a sort of a square footage?
They believe that our schools can accommodate more people than we believe that they can.
There's two things that go into the state formula. One is they have to agree with the number of teaching stations that we have. But even if we have the same number of teaching stations, they use a different formula, more students per classroom than we do. So they're always going to come out differently than we do.
Okay, so they'll always come out differently, but with our new actual numbers, is there a case that we can make to change their currently assigned capacity numbers?
They're potentially.
In our favor, absolutely we'll try.
We try to be strategic about, making our adjustments to state-rated capacity because we have pending capital projects that we want to make sure we have them funded. I think we're trying to be open here and show you that these are their numbers, but we're not, like as Ken said, if it's in our favor, we'll certainly bring it forward to them, and they can read all of our reports. We give them a feasibility study along with our annual educational facility master plan, so they get to see this information.
Okay, thank you.
Was that Ms. Valencourt? All right, Ms. Giles.
Yeah, I want to give a thumbs up to the Gilbert study, and the approach appears to be very thorough. But I would echo what Mrs. French said in terms of this does change the playground, okay? It changes the playing field because we've been looking at certain numbers and applying those over time. And so I think it only prudent to expect that part of the task of the attendance area committee will be to look at what the impact of some of these changes are. And it may not be to make recommendations immediately, but to look at that, because it is going to change the picture, and it's going to take some time for people to understand that and appreciate what it actually means. In contrast to the high schools, where we had essentially assigned an arbitrary capacity figure, and so what was necessary is to accept a different method of calculating that capacity for the high school study. These are based on prototypes that were in place at particular times and now reflect where additions and adjustments were made. And so this is more an attempt to look at where we are based on what we've decided is appropriate at this point in time for renovations where we want to get schools. So to me, this is invaluable. And I can't wait to see, what we get to see in terms of the elementary schools to help us. But it's going to come at us at different times, and we're going to have to sort of reassess where we are each time we embark again, and as we look at the long-term impacts. I'm glad this is where we've gotten. It's going to make things a little bit difficult initially to get used to this and make sure that everyone's comfortable with that, but I'm delighted to see that these are the numbers we're actually working with, and we can have a better understanding when we have discussions about what's actually in place at individual schools based on how they can service the needs of the students. And even then, there will be some adjustments that are unique to certain, based on programs that are in place in the schools, because these are, again, just capacity numbers, just how many classrooms can be used there. But I think it gives us a much more secure base to feel comfortable as we build and go forward with the numbers. And I would love it if we could get the state to accept the ratios that we apply for appropriate, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Go ahead.
Ms. DeLacy.
Yes, Joel, I'm looking at the farms numbers,
Okay.
and just reading for the listeners who will be people that can't sleep at night and might flip this on. Bonnie Branch goes from 17% farms to 19%. Burley Manor, 7 to 7%. Clarksville has no farms eligible students, and they'll still have no farms eligible students. Dunlogan, 17 to 17. Elk Ridge Landing, middle, 14 to 9. And I go down to Lake Elkhorn, 47% farms, 47% farms. Harper's Choice, my neighborhood, 34% farms to 34% farms. I'm just looking at Oakland Mills, middle, 40% farms to 40% farms. Tucson Valley, 32 to 37. Wild Lake, 35 to 35. When you look at these numbers, when you're looking at redistricting, do you look at the concentration of poverty that exists? I mean, I don't want to get into whether it's social engineering or not, but I'm looking at the fact that when you have large numbers of children who live in poverty, which is 17% of our population, and I guess every school except Clarksville has farms populations. Those schools, when they're inundated with high needs populations, don't perform as well because 40% or more than 20% becomes the standard in terms of a population. Was that considered at all in making any of these changes?
What we usually do when we evaluate redistricting plans is we take a look at the change in farm that's associated with the schools that are being redistricted. We also publish, like you just read from the report, all of the farm rates alongside that, so that if someone like yourself wanted to make a point more globally about farm and poverty, they could use our information to address that point. But, you know, we're starting from the place of trying to bring capacity to bear on overcrowded schools.
So capacity is the overarching, that's the structure of the 11 criteria, that's number one, correct?
No.
I didn't say it that way.
Well, but what I'm saying is, you say no, Ellen, but that's what he just said. So obviously, it's not farms.
That's what you heard. That's not what he's trying to tell you. It's not what he said.
Well, Mr. Gallagher, maybe you can clarify.
I'll do my best. I think everybody's going to look at this and see something a little bit different. I mean, it's complicated, and it's social issues, these that we're talking about here. So I don't want to try to, tread, clumsily across these topics. But we're starting with an issue of capacity utilization of schools. That's what led us to believe that we needed to build Middle School 20. And we set other goals in terms of, let me see where in terms of relieving the schools in the Northeast along Route 1 corridor and limiting necessary student movement in developing this plan. And that came out of citizen input, that, redistricting broadly beyond what you're trying to accomplish with the new capital facility can be very disruptive, and it's hard for some people to see the value of that. So what we tried to be in presenting these farm data on this redistricting plan is be neutral in terms of showing all farm rates for all schools, whether they were a part of the redistricting plan or not. Where there is a delta, that's a school that was a part of the redistricting plan, so you can talk about the pros and cons of this plan in terms of what changes it's making. If you're interested in a larger, more global view of where the concentrations of poverty are in the school system, you can use that report to make that point as well. So I think that we're at least bringing something to the table that different people with different questions and concerns can use to discuss farm rates in terms of what's changing based upon this proposed plan and what already is in place as the numbers are reported for the schools that are not being redistricted. Maybe I should do some more listening. Want to say anything else?
Ms. Lacey, do you have any more questions? Okay. If I could just ask a few clarifying points, I'll just to dovetail off what Mr. Lacey said, just to clarify, as it states in the plan, for the schools that are affected, there's a negligible impact on any changes to farms populations amongst those schools, correct, as I read it here? Okay. There were a couple things in the presentation that you mentioned, and it may be beneficial for the people who are watching. You mentioned that the feasibility study looks at exploring closing West Friendship Elementary School. That is not going to be something that we're going to be determining as part of this redistricting process, correct?
Yes, sir. What we're doing here is announcing.
What does yes, sir mean? Yes, you agree with what he's just said, or?
Is that something that we're going to be doing as a part of this redistricting? I guess no. So we are.
I asked it in a negative. I said this is not something that we're going to be deciding on as part of this redistricting process.
You got, yeah.
Sorry, I asked the question poorly.
It is indeed not going to be something.
I just want to clarify for the record so we don't start getting the emails coming in.
It's, we want people to know that we are planning this closure. We're not obviously doing elementary redistricting. That, what I said earlier in the presentation is there's value in repeating it, is that you need to start out with the announcement in order to start the process for the school closure policy. And then the redistricting is going to come in a later year. We have to take a look at that, look at our other goals of maybe having a pause and what we want to get out of this overall. But this report is intended to put that recommendation out there so that everyone has an opportunity to talk about it. There's chronic underutilization at that school. There's costs associated with that. There's underutilized capacity at other schools. There's costs associated with that. And the changes have impact on the neighborhoods and so forth. So we want to be able to begin the process under the policy for closing schools and hear from everyone that policy articulates we should be hearing from. And so that would be a separate process from the middle school redistricting.
But the board will not be acting on it as part of this process.
As a part of this redistricting process.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next thing that was in the report talked about planning for a new high school in the Route 1 corridor, anticipating about 1,000 new students and those type of things. And there's a recommendation in there to pursue land in the land bank, which I think is something we're all united in feeling we definitely need to build extra capacity. So that's something that's in there. So that's an area I think that the community can be very happy about. Ms. DeLacy, did you have another question?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Brian.
Go right ahead.
I do, now that you brought it up, the closing of West Friendship, I think that it is something that we should put on the table and talk about. I think it said it took, and I can't remember because it seems like as if I had about 4 different packages that I was working with, going back and forth. So I can't remember what, was it in the feasibility study?
It takes 27 months.
I heard 17 on one of
I
them.
thought it was 27.
It was 17 on one of them. What page was it?
I think it is 27. Yeah.
What page is it? Because I thought initially I saw 20, I heard 27, but
Well, maybe that's high school.
someplace on here it said 17 months.
Yes.
What page is it?
It's going to be probably in the elementary section, Western region, starting 16, 17.
What page? 16, what does it say?
Sorry, 17. Starting 17.
So it's on page 17, and what does it say? I'm trying to find it, because I've got so much underlined and all that, so it
Well,
says,
I mean, the
no,
very
I just
first
want to know
sentence-
where it says how many months, so
Oh,
just help
okay.
me find it. Because I'm sure I read 17, although goodness knows, anything could happen in my brain.
It says a minimum of 14 months in that paragraph.
Okay.
On page 17.
Good, because I know I didn't read 27. So and I remember reading that we will save $2 million a year and the staff could be absorbed. Oh, here it is. The operating cost savings of closing West Friendship Elementary has been estimated to be approximately $2 million per year. Staff positions would be absorbed through vacancies across the system. This report recommends proceeding with the closure of West Friendship Elementary because excess capacity in Western region persists and the funds for a modern wastewater system are more likely invested in construction of a new system. So, I mean, this is part of the feasibility study. So we need to get on with this conversation and have it.
What I believe the question that Mr. Meshkin
Right,
asked.
I'm not, this is just something that I'm bringing up, not Mr. Meshkin's
Okay,
question.
all right, very good.
So if it's not here, where is it? Where do we talk about this?
It would have to be in a separate report that is founded on policy 6070, discontinuation of school use. So that process would have to be started, put on your schedule.
14
planned for.
14 months.
Yeah. So what this report basically is putting out the recommendation, but there would have to be a follow-up with the full analysis following every step through that policy as approved by the board at the time whenever that year that policy was approved.
Okay, and another reason I'm bringing this up is at, when we had the legislative committee meeting, I think Dr. Siddiqui, you were there, and I know a number of us, and that's before I was on the board, but I listened to the legislators, and in fact, Senator Kittleman talked about when he was on the county council, it was, you all said, build them and the people will come, and he talked about the fact that we have these multi-million-dollar schools out in the West that are not at capacity, and so we've got a school with 253 students in it, and I think it's time that we have the conversation about closing the school. It's a wonderful school. It's a wonderful school. I love it. But we're talking about, making decisions and choices. And I know that we probably have not made it's wasteful, according to the legislators, for us to continue with the open seats in the West that will never be filled.
Do you have any other questions, Ms. DeLacy?
That's it. Thank you.
Mrs. French.
This board and this staff could have solved the problem for West Friendship in the last 2 years of redistricting proposals. We had the opportunity to move students from Waverly to West Friendship. Manor Woods is way overcrowded. They're only 2 miles apart. And I think the main reason that you want to target that school is because it's on septic. And if we really wanted to, and now we're spending money to put an addition on Waverly for additional capacity. So I think it's just specious to say that we're saving $2 million by closing West Friendship, when we're not looking at all of the other options we could have addressed or done up until now, and still could do. And I will admit that my 2 children went to West Friendship, and it's a wonderful school. They have the most beautiful SCH program every year, and their teachers are excellent. It's a gem, despite it being the oldest school building in the county. So new does not mean better necessarily.
Thank you, Mrs. French. I think West Friendship's a pearl as well. I think that would be a hard sell. I do have a question about how our process this year will be affected by comprehensive rezoning. The county council will be, zoning board, will be approving the comprehensive rezoning July 25th. I know I bring up a lot of issues between how we as one hand speak with the county council on the other hand with regards to these issues. And I spoke with Courtney, Ms. Watson, about this, and she said when she was on the school board, there was a time during a rezoning where they got updated numbers and updated projections based upon some changes that had been made at the county. Is that something, I know I've advocated for it, but is this something that we would contemplate this year in light of the fact Dr. Siddiqui raised some very good points about some issues with regards to comprehensive rezoning when we're looking at Limekiln Middle School, going to be post this redistricting without the potential additional densities that are being projected for the apartments that could potentially go into Fulton. Are we going to look at some of those issues because it'll still be within the window of the time that the attendance area committee will be meeting when they act on the 25th? A lot of this, I'm guessing, is computerized. Is that something that staff would be willing to entertain since we've done it before?
Yeah, you answered the question. Is that if it was done before, certainly it could be done again. But I've been talking to the planning director about getting information. But again, it's important to see what the council actually approves. These are applicant-initiated proposals, but they are not applicant approved. The council has that job, and so they don't necessarily approve all of them. So we want to get that information and then use it for making adjustments. It won't be as simple as just feeding a few new numbers into the WIFR and then all of a sudden it's a new projection. It'll be more of a advisory table or something that we can take a look at and talk about. But I intend to get that information as soon as they can make it available to me.
Okay,
Answer that question?
I think so. How do we all feel about that? Do we feel that that's?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, we need a motion then on the Attendance Area Adjustment Committee.
I'll move approval, that the board approve the superintendent's recommendation in terms of moving forward with an attendance area committee to look at redistricting for the middle schools.
Second.
All righty. Any further discussion? I'm sorry, Ms. DeLacy.
Just assurance that there will be more hands-on in the process of selection and interviewing than there has been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Foos. All righty. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Mrs. French? So we're 1, 2, 3, 4.
It's my protest. I am really opposed to using Gilbert study numbers when the board has not adopted them.
A very fair concern. We'll note that in the minutes. 5-1, it passes. Mrs. Hanks. All right. Is there anything else that we have to discuss this evening? All righty. Thank you all.
We're adjourned.
We're adjourned.